8 kings ruled the earth for 241,200 years. Then a flood wiped them from history. That isn't a line from a fantasy novel. That is literally written on clay tablets that have survived for 5,000 years. Right now in museum vaults and glass cases, you can find it. The Sumerian King List, carefully preserved, meticulously translated, and completely impossible according to everything we think we know about human history. These aren't vague campfire legends passed down by word of mouth. They're administrative records, political records, lists, the kind of thing ancient scribes carved when they were trying to be precise, not poetic. And that's what makes it so uncomfortable. The numbers are too sharp to be symbolic, too consistent across multiple copies to be dismissed as mistakes, too extreme to fit neatly into our evolution timeline. Tonight, we're going to walk straight into that contradiction. What happens when ancient written records directly clash with modern science? And why some of these tablets quietly disappeared from public view after they were translated? Before we dive into clay and kings and floods, hit like if this kind of deep time archaeology pulls you in, and subscribe so you don't miss the next layers of this rabbit hole. Also, drop a comment with where you're watching from and what time it is there, because we're about to talk about a version of time that makes clocks feel like toys. Let's rewind to around 3500 BC, southern Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq. Something insane happens. On the empty, flat plains between the Tigris and Euphrates, cities appear. Not little villages, slowly growing over thousands of years. We're talking walls, districts, temples, processional roads, already laid out. At basically the same time, writing appears. Not, this is a cow, stick figures that slowly evolve. Not scratch symbols that take centuries to become a script. We get cuneiform, a fully functional writing system that can already handle taxes, trade, laws, myth, prayer, abstract concepts, right from the jump. And alongside that, a base 60 math system, sexagesimal, so precise that we still use it today to measure time, 60 seconds, 60 minutes, and angles 360 degrees. Archaeology textbooks love to call this the birth of civilization, but the Sumerians themselves, they tell a very different story. Their earliest texts don't talk about inventing civilization. They talk about inheriting it, not discovery. Remembrance. Enter the Sumerian King List, carved into clay around 2100 BC. Copied many times in later centuries, it's basically a chronological list of rulers and cities. It starts with a single sentence. When kingship was lowered from heaven, kingship was an Eridu. We'll come back to that phrase. Then it drops the bomb. The list names 8 rulers who reigned before a great flood. Alulum of Eridu, 28,800 years. Alauger, 36,000 years. Enmenluana, 43,200 years. And so on, 8 kings total. When you add up their reigns, you get 241,200 years. That's longer than Homo sapiens as a species is usually credited with behaving like modern humans. When scholars first translated this in the early 1900s, they pretty much panicked academically and slapped the mythology label on it. Those can be real years. Obviously exaggerated. Obviously symbolic. Calm down. Some tried to rescue it with math. Maybe they meant lunar months instead of years. Okay, still thousands of years per king. Maybe these are dynasties, not individuals. But the structure of the text lists each as a single ruler, one after another. Others suggested scribal errors, copying mistakes, or esoteric numerology we just don't understand. But every attempt to shrink those numbers, to make them less insane, hits a wall. The same numbers show up again and again on different copies of the King List found in different cities from different centuries. The clay doesn't care that we're uncomfortable. It just preserves what was told. And then comes a line that repeats across versions like a ritual. After the flood had swept over, and kingship had descended from heaven, kingship was in Kish. Not, after the flood, people reorganized. After the flood, kingship developed. No, descended. The same verb they use for. Rain falling, birds landing. A thing above that comes down. Now, in Sumerian cosmology, heaven isn't just clouds and blue sky. It's in the realm of order of the gods, of the beings that decide what happens below. The word and means both sky and God, as the idea above and divine are literally the same thing. So when these tablets say kingship descended from heaven, they're not being flowery. They're describing an arrival. You can absolutely read that symbolically if you want. Divine authority, legitimacy, all that. But here's the weird part. Sumerian literature doesn't show a slow evolution toward this idea. It's there from the beginning, fully formed, taken for granted, stated as plainly as grain rations and tax records. Meanwhile, under the ground, archaeologists are digging. Beneath the ruins of Eridu, Uruk, and Kish, the same cities named in the King List, they start finding something that makes a tablet harder to write off. They find cities stacked on cities. Each generation builds over the rubble of the last, layer upon layer. And in between some of the oldest layers, they find thick bands of water-laid silt, clean flood deposits. No artifacts, no fire ash, just pure sediment. Evidence of catastrophic flooding. Exactly where the King List says a great flood happened. So now we have clay tablets talking about a flood, soil layers that prove a flood. At that point, metaphor starts feeling a little thin. The flood story isn't just a myth, it's geology. And it doesn't stop in Mesopotamia. You know these names. Utnapishtim in the Epic of Gilgamesh, Noah in Genesis, Manu in the Vedas, Deucalion in Greek myth, Nuyu in Hawaiian lore. Different cultures, different details, same core structure. A civilization becomes doomed. A chosen person or family gets warned. A sealed vessel, boat, chest, ark. Waters rise. The old world dies. Survival on a mountain. A bird sent to find dry land. A new beginning. That repetition across continents is strange. Strange enough that in 2000, geologists William Ryan and Walter Pittman put forward a theory. Around 5600 BC, the Black Sea, then a freshwater lake, was suddenly flooded by the Mediterranean. A natural dam at the Bosporus gave way. A waterfall larger than anything on Earth today roared in. Coastline villages were drowned in a geologic blink. Other researchers point to even earlier events. Meltwater pulses at the end of the Younger Dryas around 9600 BC, when enormous ice sheets collapsed and sea levels jumped. The Persian Gulf Basin, once a dry, fertile valley, slowly swallowed by rising seas. On those now submerged coasts, archaeologists have found traces of pre-Sumerian settlements, stone tools, hints of structures, now underwater. The people who lived there, their stories didn't survive on stone. They survived in myth. So maybe when the Sumerians carved the flood into clay, they weren't inventing it. They were remembering it. But that's not actually what freaks scholars out the most. Floods we can handle. Climate events, sea level rise, lost coastlines. That all fits into our scientific worldview. What really disturbs people is what the Sumerians say they knew after flood. Because if the story is just big disaster, humans rebuild. That's one thing. But the tablets don't say that. They say something came back. And whatever it was, it didn't just bring kings. It brought knowledge. The kind of knowledge we don't think humans should have had that early at all. The same structure, same elements as Noah, on a tablet that existed more than 1,000 years before the Hebrew Bible was written. Victorian England was not ready for, hey, your sacred flood story is actually a Mesopotamian remix. This was front page news. The idea that Genesis might be borrowing instead of originating shook a lot of people. But as wild as that was, it was just the beginning. Because the deeper translators went, the more the tablets started talking about beings that weren't just gods in the poetic sense, but felt disturbingly technical. The Sumerians called their gods the Anunnaki, usually translated as those who from heaven to earth came. In their worldview, these weren't vague forces of nature. They were personalities. They held counsel. They argued. They punished. They rewarded. They built. They walked in cities. They handed kings their scepters. They physically interacted with the world. The god Enki, especially, stands out. He's not just god of wisdom in a fluffy, abstract way. He's the engineer, the one who sets things in order, the one associated with fresh water, the Abzu, the deep, and with the design of life itself. Which brings us to one of the most uncomfortable texts ever dug from the Mesopotamian ground, the Atrahasis epic. This is one of the oldest versions of the flood story. But before the flood, it describes the creation of humans. And it does it in a tone that feels less like a hymn and more like a lab manual. The story starts with a problem. The lesser gods, the Igigi, are doing all the hard labor, digging canals, maintaining rivers, basically terraforming Mesopotamia. After thousands of years, they've had enough. They revolt. They surround Enlil's house and demand to be freed from their work. Instead of punishing them, the higher gods get together and Enki proposes a workaround. Let us create a worker to bear the yoke. Not a symbolic being. A solution. The text described the process. A god is sacrificed. His blood and flesh are mixed with clay. The goddess of birth, Nintu, shapes this mixture. 7 male and 7 female molds or vessels are prepared. Ritual words are spoken. From this mixture, humans emerge. The language is shockingly procedural. Mix this with that. Use this many vessels. Follow this order. It reads like a recipe. For thousands of years, people just shrugged and said, myth. But when you read it in the original structure, it doesn't sound like a metaphor for the mystery of life. It sounds like people trying to describe biological engineering in the simplest terms they had. Clay equals raw earth/physical matter. Divine blood equals genetic template/life essence. 7 male, 7 female equals initial breeding population. And the stated purpose of these humans? Not to worship, not to experience love, not to seek enlightenment, but to work, to take over the labor the Igigi no longer wanted. According to the oldest written story of our origin, we were created as a worker species, designed, tasked, then left to inherit the mess. When you hold one of these tablets, archaeologists say it's like holding compressed time. Each wedge is a moment frozen. Someone sat there 4,000 to 5,000 years ago, pressing a reed stylus into wet clay, line after line, believing that what they were writing mattered enough to last beyond their own bones. And it did. When cities burned, the clay fired harder. When empires collapsed, the tablet stayed. When languages died, the signs waited. Thousands of years later, some guy in a museum basement brushes the dust off and the sentence just continues, as if history had paused mid-breath and then resumed. And inside that pause, there's a question. Did the people who wrote this know they were living in the after of something? Did they sense that they were inheriting somebody else's world? Because they never called themselves the first. They called themselves the black-headed people, the ones made by divine hands. But they also hinted others, beings whose names don't appear in the king list, who aren't counted among the human kings. Beings said to have lived before the flood, beings that taught, beings that ruled, beings whose reign stretched so long the scribes could only express it in tens of thousands of years. Were those just deified memories of ancient rulers? Exaggerations that got out of hand? Or were they trying to describe something in someone that doesn't fit in the human category at all? You can stand today on the plains where the Tigris and Euphrates meet. The wind moves through the reeds with a soft hiss, almost like whispering. Somewhere under your feet, meters down, are ruins of cities that rose and fell long before Rome, long before Egypt built pyramids, long before the Bible was written. Beneath those ruins, in deeper layers, are older cities. And beneath those, silt, flood, reset. We're taught that history is a straight line. Hunter-gatherers, farmers, villages, cities, writing technology. The clay tells a different story. World, flood, survivors' memory. The Sumerians weren't just chronicling themselves. They were trying to preserve the echo of a world before them. A world that ruled for 241,200 years. A world that ended in water. And a world we might never fully reconstruct, unless we pay attention to the places where the soil and the stories agree. Because if writing appears suddenly, fully formed, and cities appear suddenly, fully planned, and astronomy appears suddenly, fully accurate, then maybe, just maybe, we're not looking at the beginning of something. We're looking at a restart. And to understand what came before that restart, we have to dig deeper into the dirt, into the language, and into the parts of the archaeological record that most textbooks quietly skip. In the next part, we're going to do exactly that. We'll go down through those layers, beneath Sumer, beneath the cities we know, to the cultures that came before them, and to the skulls, artifacts, and ruins that archaeology found, and then tried very hard not to talk about. When an archaeologist digs, they're not just moving dirt, they're moving time. Every layer is a moment. A house fire, a collapsed wall, a street abandoned and buried. In most places on Earth, you dig a few meters and you hit virgin soil. No more artifacts, no more potsherds, no more humans. But in Mesopotamia, you dig, and the cities just keep going. Take Eridu, for example. On paper, Eridu is just another ruin in southern Iraq. In reality, it's something else entirely. The Sumerians themselves called Eridu the first city. The King List says kingship was first held there before the flood. When archaeologists excavated it, they expected a small early settlement. Instead, they found 18 separate temple levels, stacked like pages in a book. Temple built, temple destroyed or buried. New temple built directly on top. Repeat, the oldest temple they reached dates to around 5400 BC. Already a full-fledged religious complex, sitting over 1,000 years before Sumer officially exists. Beneath that, a thick layer of silt, flood deposits. And below that silt, traces of an even earlier settlement. Cruder in materials, yes, but weirdly deliberate in planning. Foundations laid out as if someone already understood how to design a city. So at Eridu you get this pattern. City, flood, older city. Exactly what the tablets describe. Move over to Uruk, the city of Gilgamesh, one of the oldest major cities in human history. German archaeologists dug down through its famous ziggurat and city walls and found Uruk I, Uruk II, Uruk III, Uruk IV, and so on. Each level is another version of the city, rebuilt over the last. But here's the strange part. When they reached the oldest layers, instead of primitive huts and clumsy layouts, they found monumental buildings, planned streets, advanced, large-scale temple architecture. The deeper they went, the more sophisticated things looked. Civilization is supposed to evolve from simple to complex. At Uruk, it almost feels like the opposite. The oldest city layers look like the work of people who already knew what a city should be. Then there's Kish. According to the Sumerian King List, after the flood, kingship descended from heaven to Kish. So, naturally, archaeologists went looking. In the 1920s, excavators dug deep beneath the later city layers and found that familiar band of clean flood silt. Under it, a pre-Sumerian layer full of things that shouldn't be there. Tools made of copper, in a time when stone should still dominate. Pottery fired at very high temperatures, requiring precise control of heat. Evidence of kills more advanced than you'd expect for early farmers. It looked less like a culture developing technology, and more like a culture rebuilding with tech it half remembered. To make it weirder, at some sites archaeologists found patches of vitrified soil, earth turned to glass. That takes temperatures above 1,400 degrees Celsius. Far hotter than any campfire. Hotter than simple kills. And it wasn't just a small spot like a lightning strike. It appeared in layers. Something, before Sumer, scorched parts of Mesopotamia hard enough to melt the ground. You can probably guess how much the textbooks want to talk about that. Now we have to talk about the people who lived there before the Sumerians. Archaeologists call them the Ubaid culture. They were around from about 6,500 to 3,800 BC. No writing, no king lists, no epic poems, no recorded names. But they built some of the earliest temples at Eridu and other sites, dug irrigation canals, farmed, fished, and lived in permanent settlements, laid the very groundwork Sumer would later build on. They're like a ghost civilization, everywhere in the layers, nowhere in the history books. And they left us two major things: their architecture, their figurines. Let's start with the buildings. Ubaid temples and houses were not randomly oriented huts. They're aligned to cardinal directions. often laid out on straight axes, built with symmetry that suggests planning and measurement. Some alignments seem to match key celestial events, sunrise points, star risings. In other words, whoever was building these places already cared about the sky. This isn't just, we need a roof over our heads. It looks like a worldview carved into architecture. Now, the part that really bothers archaeologists, the Abaid figurines. Thousands of them have been found across multiple sites. They're small clay figures, often a few inches tall, and they don't look human. They have elongated, almost pointed skulls, very large almond or slit-shaped eyes, long, thin necks, narrow faces, often with almost no nose, a kind of reptilian or amphibian vibe. Some are standing, some are seated, some are holding infants that look just like them. Many are wearing what look like robes, belts, or decorated garments. In museums, the labels usually say something like ritual object, fertility figurine, cultic representation, which is archaeology speak for we have no idea, but we have to call it something. The standard explanation is, oh, it's stylized, it's symbolic, just art. But here's the issue. They're too consistent. Across time, across sites, across distance. Same general head shape, same eyes, same body proportions. They're not random abstractions. They're not a mix of animals and humans. They're a type, like they're depicting a specific kind of being. Some scholars have tried to connect this to cranial binding, the practice of wrapping babies' heads so their skulls grow elongated. We know many cultures did that, but the Abaid figurines predate known cranial binding in the region by thousands of years. Binding changes skull shape, but not the facial structure, the eyes, nose, and jaw, which in these figurines are all off from normal human. So if they were imitating an elite class with deformed skulls, where did that elite get their look? And if they weren't imitating humans at all, who or what were they imitating? Now zoom out. By around 3800 BC, the Abaid culture suddenly disappears. Not gradually, not a slow fade. At some sites, they leave in a hurry. At Tel Brak in northern Mesopotamia, excavations uncovered a mass grave from around that time. Hundreds of bodies dumped together, showing signs of violence, blunt force trauma, weapon wounds. People buried without ceremony. Around the same period, many Abaid sites are abandoned, tools left behind, pottery still in place. It looks like disruption. War? Famine? Social collapse? Or something bigger? Whatever happened, within a few centuries, a new culture appears over the same land. Sumer, with writing, massive temples, city-states, a complete pantheon, advanced mathematics, formal law, a full-blown cosmology. It's like watching someone come into a ruined, half-burnt library and start copying whatever books are still partially readable. There's one more piece to this. The land we now call the Persian Gulf. Today, it's shallow sea between Iraq, Iran, Kuwait, and the Arabian Peninsula. But not that long ago, geologically speaking, it wasn't water. It was a valley. Rivers flowed through it. The Tigris, Euphrates, Karun, and others, merging into one huge fertile basin. Archaeologists Juris Zurins and later researchers used geology and satellite data to map ancient riverbeds on the seafloor. They're still there, huge winding channels now drowned under Gulf. The idea is simple. During the last ice age and early Holocene, sea levels were much lower. That valley was dry and habitable. People would have settled there. Why wouldn't they? It had water, fish, and rich soil. As ice melted and oceans rose, the valley slowly flooded. By around 6000 to 4000 BC, that whole basin was underwater. Anyone living there would have been forced to migrate upstream toward today's Iraq and Iran. Now imagine you're a descendant of those people. Your grandparents told you stories of cities in a valley, land where 4 great rivers met, a world that vanished under rising water. You grow up on the edges of that loss. In the uplands we now call Mesopotamia, you remember fragments of what they knew, star patterns, building principles, myths of strange rulers and sky beings. You rebuild with what you have left. You settle places like Eridu and Uruk. You draw from old knowledge you can't completely explain anymore. And eventually, centuries later, your descendants call themselves Sumerians, and when they carve their history into clay, they don't say, "We invented all this." They say, "We received it. We rebuilt it. We stand on ruins." So when we go down through the layers, at the top, Sumer, with writing in kings and gods. Beneath Sumer, Abade, with strange figurines, planned temples, and skyline buildings. Beneath that, Flood Silt. Beneath that, traces of a world we can barely touch. The official story says, civilization started here. The ground seems to say, no, civilization restarted here. And if that's true, then the next mystery isn't just what they knew, it's how they were talking about it. Because the language they used, the Sumerian language itself, doesn't behave like something that slowly evolved. It behaves like something installed. In the next part, we're going to dive into that language. Why it appears out of nowhere, why it has no relatives, and why its structure looks less like a village dialect and more like something that was deliberately engineered. Let's talk about the strangest things Sumer left behind. Not the cities, not the temples, not even the King List. Their language. Because Sumerian doesn't behave like a language that crawled out of prehistory. It behaves like a language that someone dropped in, fully formed. When linguists study where languages come from, they usually see clear family trees. You've got Latin, Spanish, French, Italian, Portuguese, Proto-Indo-European, Sanskrit, Greek, Germanic, Celtic, Old Chinese, Classical Chinese, Modern Mandarin, Cantonese, etc. You can trace how sounds change, how grammar evolves, how words drift over time. Nothing stays frozen. Now enter Sumerian. It appears in the archaeological record around 3200 BC, written in cuneiform, already doing backflips, legal texts, temple accounts, hymns, narratives, administrative records, no baby phase, no crude, half-formed sentences, no early scribbles learning how to be a language. It's already running. And here's the kicker. It has no known relatives. None. Not a parent, not a sister, not a child. It's a language isolate. Now, language isolates aren't unheard of. We have Basque in Europe, Ainu in Japan, Burushaski in Pakistan. But those are spoken languages that survive in isolated pockets, mountains, islands, protected valleys. Sumerian wasn't on some remote island. It sat at the crossroads of ancient trade, surrounded by other languages. Akkadian, Elamite, later Babylonian, and Assyrian. And yet, it stayed totally alien. Here's where it gets even weirder. Around 2300 BC, the Akkadians, Semitic speakers, take over much of Sumer. They become the new political power. Now, normally when that happens, the conqueror's language eventually replaces the old one. But instead of killing Sumerian, they adopted it. For the next 2,000 years, Sumerian becomes like their Latin, the language of religion, the language of law, the language of science and scholarship. They wrote hymns in Sumerian. They did rituals in Sumerian. They taught scribes Sumerian long after nobody spoke it at home. And when we find the textbooks, they used to learn it. That's where the alarm bells really start ringing. Archaeologists have uncovered thousands of teaching tablets, vocabulary lists, verb drills, bilingual Sumerian Akkadian phrases, grammar exercises. This is ancient schoolwork. You can literally see scribal students practicing the same signs over and over. Sometimes the teacher's neat, perfect writing is on one side, and the student's messy attempt is on the other. And in those tablets, you find little notes like, old form, as spoken in ancient times. Archaic version. Think about that. By the time they were learning Sumerian, Sumerian was already old, even to them. We're talking like if modern students learned English from Shakespeare and kept saying, yeah, this is the old, sacred version. We don't talk like this anymore, but this is how the gods wrote it. It wasn't evolving. It was being maintained, held in place. Now let's talk structure. If you've ever tried to study a foreign language, You know some are more complex than others. Sumerian is intense. It's what's called agglutinative. Instead of breaking meaning into lots of separate tiny words, it just stacks chunks together onto one word like Lego. One Sumerian word can do the job of an entire sentence. For example, a single verb can encode who's doing the action, who's receiving it, where it's going, in what direction, for whom, and what kind of action it is, all inside one compact form. Imagine if English had a word that meant, "He will give from his house to me on purpose." That's normal in Sumerian. The order of these pieces is rigid, like slots in an equation. If you shuffle them, it breaks. It doesn't feel like a language that's slowly drifted into place because of casual speech. It feels more like a system, designed for precision, almost like it was engineered. Now, go back one step further. Before full Sumerian writing, we have what's called proto-cuneiform. These are some of the earliest tablets from Uruk, around 3400 BC. The signs are more pictographic than the later wedge script, and they don't behave like a normal language yet. Some tablets seem to store numbers, commodity marks, abstract counts, more like a code than complete sentences, almost like a notation system that later had Sumerian plugged into it. When scholars try to read all proto-cuneiform texts as Sumerian, a lot of it just doesn't fit cleanly. That's led some researchers to suggest that the writing system may have originally existed separate from Sumerian. Sumerian was later written onto that existing system, which raises a big question. Where did Sumerian itself come from? If it wasn't slowly born from that script, was it imported from somewhere else? Or preserved from someone else? There's another clue: substrate words. These are words inside Sumerian for basic things, plants, tools, objects that don't seem to have Sumerian origins. They don't follow the usual patterns. They look like loan words from some older, unknown language that came before. It's like finding random pieces of an older operating system hidden inside the code of a newer one. We don't know what that earlier language was called. We've never found it written, but its fingerprints are still there. The Sumerians themselves didn't treat their language as something they invented. They treated it as something given. They had a goddess of writing and grain named Nisaba. Texts describe her as she who knows the secrets of numbers, who sets the measuring line, who perfects the tablets. Language is framed as sacred technology. In hymns, they say the gods made the tongue of Sumer splendid, directed the words of the great gods. Not, we created language, but they configured it. There's even a Sumerian story that mirrors the Tower of Babel legend. In one composition, we're told there was a time when the people of the world, in unison, spoke to Enlil in one tongue. Then the gods changed their speech and confused the languages. The original perfect tongue? Sumerian. In their eyes, their language wasn't just old. It was the first language. And everything else was a broken version of it. Myth? Maybe. But myth often preserves truths in symbolic form. If an older civilization collapsed and a remnant language survived in rituals and sacred training, it would absolutely be remembered as the language of the gods, the tongue from before confusion, the original way the world was ordered. And then there's the script itself. Cuneiform is intuitive. You don't accidentally invent wedge marks pressed with a reed stylus. You need specialized tools, need standardized sign forms, need training to write quickly and consistently. But the earliest tablets we found are written by scribes who clearly already know what they're doing. There's no visible practice phase in the archaeological record. No awkward, half-baked early attempts. We just find fully formed sign systems, structured layout, complex lists, correct grammar. From day one, it's like turning on a computer for the first time and finding not a blank screen, but a fully stocked operating system with files, programs, and user manuals already in place. Some scholars have suggested we're missing earlier phases of writing that were destroyed by time. That might be true, but based on what we do have, writing and the Sumerian language appear on the stage not as a newborn, but as an heir, walking and already crowned. So put this together: a language with no family tree, a grammar that looks engineered, a script that shows no visible evolution, teaching tablets that already treat the language as ancient, substrate words hinting at something older beneath it, myths that say language and knowledge were given, not discovered. If the Sumerians weren't the first, if they were inheriting, then Sumerian might not be the start of the story at all. It might be the last survivor of a much older tongue, carried to catastrophe, frozen into ritual, and finally pressed into clay. And that leads to the next big question. If the language and knowledge were inherited, who did they say gave it to them? In the next part, we'll dive into Sumerian theology itself, the Anunnaki, the me, and the idea that civilization came not from human trial and error, but from a descent, from beings the tablets describe not as metaphors, but as very real, very present rulers of a world that ended in water. So if the Sumerians inherited their language and their systems, who were they inheriting from? In their own words, the answer is simple. The Anunnaki. But what the tablets actually say about these beings is way stranger than what you normally hear on documentaries or fringe websites. For the Sumerians, reality was layered. You had an heaven, the sky, the realm of order, Ki, earth, the physical world, and the space between where things move back and forth. The Anunnaki literally means those who from heaven to earth came. That's not a nickname. That's the dictionary definition. Now, in most modern religions, gods are abstract. You pray to them, you imagine them, but they don't show up on your street corner. The Sumerian gods weren't like that. Their texts talk about them as if you could bump into them in the city. They held council meetings, argued, took sides in wars, gave orders, lived in specific cities. And they definitely didn't stay up there. The tablets constantly describe them coming down, landing, entering temples, departing, and returning to heaven. For the Sumerians, this wasn't symbolism. It was logistics. Two of the main players are Enki and Enlil. Think of Enki as the engineer and Enlil as the administrator. Enki, god of fresh water, wisdom, creation, deep knowledge, patron of Eridu, the first city, the one who solves problems rather than punishes. Enlil, god of air, wind, command, lord of Nippur, the religious capital, the one whose word is law. And above even them sits an sky father, more remote, less involved. The Anunnaki as a group are often described as great gods, judges, determiners of destinies. But then you get stories like the Atrahasis epic that yank all of this out of the myth poetry zone and drop it into something that reads almost procedural. Atrahasis starts not with humans, but with tired gods. According to the story, the lesser gods, called the Igigi, are doing the grunt work. They dig canals. They shape the land. They maintain the irrigation systems. For thousands of years, eventually they snap. They surround Enlil's house with tools on fire like, "We're done. We quit. No prayer. No worship song. It's a labor strike." So the senior gods hold a meeting to figure out what to do. Enlil wants punishment. Enki suggests outsourcing. Let's make workers to do this instead. Being smart enough to follow instructions, but not powerful enough to cause rebellion. Then the text gets disturbingly specific. They select one of the rebel gods. Kill him. Mix his blood with clay. Place the mixture in 7 womb-like vessels. Perform incantations. Let the mixture mature. And then out comes Lulu, the mixed one, the human worker. We're used to creation stories like, and God said, "Let there be man," and boom. Simple, symbolic, clean. This one reads like lab notes. Ingredients, process, tools, repetition, a recipe. For thousands of years, scholars said, obviously, this is symbolic. But if you strip away the ancient vocabulary, the structure is exactly what you'd expect from some kind of deliberate bioengineering narrative. Take existing being divine template, extract essence, blood/life, combine with base material, clay/earth, create a hybrid design for a specific role. Myth? Sure, but myth with spine. And it doesn't stop there. The Sumerians say the Anunnaki didn't just make humans and walk away. They also brought something called the me. The me are one of the weirdest ideas in Sumerian religion. You can think of them as packets of civilization, modules of culture, downloadable features of being a complex society. They're not vague virtues. They're listed like a catalog. Kingship, priesthood, writing, music, law, metalworking, weaving, truth, victory, judgment, even things like descent to the underworld and ascent from the underworld. Each one is a me. Each one can be held, given, taken, transported. In one myth, Inanna, also called Ishtar, goddess of love and war, visits Enki at Eridu. He gets drunk. She convinces him to gift her more than 100 of the me. He gave her the me of kingship. He gave her the me of truth. He gave her the me of crafts. She loads him onto her boat, physical objects, not abstract energies, and sails off to Uruk. Once Enki sobers up, he realizes what he's done and sends creatures to stop her. They fail. She reaches Uruk, unloads a me, and bam, Uruk becomes a great city. Notice what the story is saying. Uruk doesn't slowly invent writing, law, music, crafts. It gets them in a single transfer. Knowledge isn't discovered. It's distributed. This same pattern shows up everywhere in ancient cultures. In Egypt, the god Thoth gives writing, mathematics, astronomy. He's the keeper of sacred texts. Humans don't invent hieroglyphs. They receive them. In Mesoamerica, Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, comes from the sky, teaches agriculture, city building, calendar systems, writing, then leaves, promising to return. In India, the rishis don't compose the Vedas. They hear them. The knowledge is called Shruti, that which is heard, not invented. In the book of Enoch, the Watchers descend, teach metallurgy, weapons, cosmetics, sorcery, astrology, and the story frames this as forbidden knowledge, which triggers a flood. Different continents, different names, same structure. We didn't make this. Someone gave it to us. Back to Sumer. Their texts are the most blunt about it. They say, kingship descended from heaven. The Anunnaki came down. They established cities. They gave mankind to me. They don't describe the gods as amorphous forces of nature. They describe them as building temples, giving orders, eating meals, traveling from city to city, appearing, disappearing, coming, going. In other words, present. Whatever they were, to the Sumerians, they were not imaginary. They walked, they judged, they taught, and then, over time, they retreated. Early on, the king list gives us those pre-flood kings with insane reign lengths. After the flood, the reigns drop, still long by our standards, but way more human. It's like this progression. First phase, non-human rulers with impossible lifespans. Second phase, hybrid/semi-divine kings, still linked to the gods. Third phase, fully human kings ruling in the name of gods who are now distant. The presence fades, but the systems stay. Writing, math, sacred rituals, ziggurats, calendars, star charts. The me stay in human hands. The original teachers don't, and the tablets occasionally hint at something even stranger. They talk about pre-flood sages called the Apkallu, 7 of them, each associated with a city, each credited with some aspect of civilization. One teaches writing. One brings ritual and law. One knows the secrets of heaven and earth. Later kings brag about being descendants of the Apkallu. The Apkallu are usually described as part human, part something else. Hybrid beings. Not full gods, not full mortals. If you step back and look at that pattern with modern eyes, it looks like this. An advanced group appears. They mentor early humans. They build the first cities. They hand over systems. Then either leave or vanish in catastrophe. What's left? Ruins under newer ruins. Myths of gods who walk the earth. Languages that seem older than the people speaking them. Knowledge that arrives fully packaged. And humans trying to live up to a blueprint they didn't write. So here's the uncomfortable fork in the road. Either every ancient civilization on multiple continents independently imagined the exact same structure. Beings came from the sky, taught us, then left, or they're all remembering the same underlying reality in their own mythic language. Maybe distorted, maybe dramatized, but rooted in something that actually happened. The Sumerians, to their credit, never once say, "We did this ourselves." They say, "We were chosen, we were taught, we inherited." In the next part, we're going to take this one step further and ask, if knowledge and kingship came down, what does the earth itself remember? Because in Mesopotamia, it's not just the tablets that tell this story. The soil does too. So we've talked about tablets. We've talked about language. We've talked about gods who came down. But if you really want to know what happened, you don't just read the stories. You dig. Because in Mesopotamia, the ground itself remembers a catastrophe so big, entire cultures had to start their timeline over. When archaeologists excavate a city, they're basically cutting a vertical slice through time. Top layers, recent history. Deeper layers, older houses, older streets. Eventually, you hit bare soil before humans lived there. That's how it usually goes. But in southern Mesopotamia, that neat pattern breaks. At sites like Eridu, Kish, and Shurapak, archaeologists hit something else. A wall of mud. Not bricks, not broken pottery. Just thick, clean, water-laid silt. Sometimes 2 meters, over 6 feet deep. No fire pits. No tools. No ancient trash. Just a sterile layer of flood deposit, sitting like a line between worlds. Below it, one kind of settlement. Above it, a different one. Leonard Woolley hit that layer at UR. He kept digging through normal city ruins until his team suddenly ran into pure, undisturbed clay. He was so sure he'd reach virgin soil that he almost stopped, but he pushed a little deeper. Underneath that sterile band, another city, an earlier settlement, older than the one above the flood layer. At Kish, archaeologist Stephen Langdon saw the same thing. At Farah, ancient Shurapak, home of the last pre-flood king in the Sumerian King List, they found the same pattern, flood silt. Then, older occupation beneath. Not every Sumerian city shows this. It wasn't a cover-the-whole-earth Hollywood-style wave, but where the texts say the flood hit hardest. The soil agrees. The flood, at least in Mesopotamia, was a metaphor. It was geology. That leaves the obvious question. When did it happen? Turns out there's more than one candidate. In the early 2000s, geologists William Ryan and Walter Pittman proposed a dramatic event around 5600 BC. Back then, the Black Sea wasn't a salty sea. It was a giant freshwater lake. As glacial melt raised global sea levels, Mediterranean water eventually overtopped a natural rock dam at the Bosphorus. When that barrier failed, it didn't trickle, it roared. They estimate a waterfall 10 miles wide, flowing with several hundred times the volume of Niagara Falls, raising the Black Sea over 100 meters in a short span. If you were living on the shores of that lake, farming, fishing, raising families, your entire world would have disappeared underwater in a matter of months. People would flee inland, carrying with them stories of a sea that rose and swallowed the land. Those refugees show up in the archaeological record. Around that time, you see new populations moving into Anatolia and down toward Mesopotamia. That's one scenario. But there's an even earlier and bigger one. Between about 10,800 and 9,600 BC, Earth went through a wild climate swing called a Younger Dryas. Temperatures dropped back to near Ice Age levels. Then, just as suddenly warmed again, massive ice sheets melted when those ice dams broke. Huge glacial lakes dumped into the oceans. Sea levels rose by about 120 meters, almost 400 feet, from the end of the last ice age to the early Holocene. Not all at once, but not slowly either. There were violent meltwater pulses where sea levels jumped dramatically over just a few centuries. One of those pulses, around 800 BC, lines up with something really important, the drowning of the Persian Gulf basin. Today, the Persian Gulf is a shallow arm of the sea, But satellite imagery and seabed mapping show ancient riverbeds under that water, old channels from the Tigris and Euphrates, plus other rivers now extinct. Archaeologist Jurisurans argue that this whole area used to be a huge fertile river valley, like a prehistoric super Garden of Eden. Fresh water, rich soil, protected by surrounding highlands. In other words, prime real estate for early humans. And as sea levels rose, that valley flooded. Slow at first, then faster, until the entire basin was underwater. By around 4000 BC, what had been a green valley was gone, replaced by the Gulf we know now. If people had been living there, and realistically, they almost certainly were, they would have watched their world disappear. Their only choice? Retreat up the rivers, to higher ground, to the floodplains of southern Mesopotamia, to the very places where early Sumerian cities later appeared. Those survivors wouldn't just bring tools, they'd bring stories. Stories about a green land now under the sea, a time before the waters came, a world divided into before and after. Those stories would eventually harden into myth. The Sumerian version of that memory survives in the Epic of Gilgamesh and in an even older story, Atrahasis. Here's the basic Sumerian/Babylonian flood template. The gods decide humans are a problem. One god, usually Enki/Ea, breaks rank. He warns a chosen man. Build a massive boat, seal it with pitch. Load your family animals and the seed of all living things. A storm hits that's so intense even the gods freak out. After days of chaos, the boat grounds on a mountain. The survivor releases birds to test if the waters are receding. One bird doesn't return. Land is back. Now line that up with the story of Noah. Warning, ark, pitch, 40 days and nights. Mountain, raven and dove. Covenant, different religion, same structure. And it doesn't stop there. Flood myths appear everywhere. India, Manu warned by a fish god, saved by a boat. Greece, Deucalion and Pyrrhus survive Zeus's flood in a chest. Indigenous Americas, rafts, canoes, mountains, sky serpents raising water. Pacific Islands, canoes riding over a drowned land. Over 200 cultures have some version of the waters rose, the world died, a few survived, they rebuilt. You can call that psychology, or you can call it cultural memory, but either way it's consistent. The Sumerians add one extra detail that makes their version stand out. After the whole boat on a mountain, water recedes, we're alive, part. They don't say, and then we slowly figure things out again. They say, after the flood had swept over, kingship was lowered from heaven once more. It's the same phrase as before. Kingship descends, not evolves. But this time, it doesn't come back to Eridu, the original pre-flood city on the King List. It lands in a new place. Kingship was in Kish. Same game, new board, same download, different capital, the pre-flood world. 8 kings, unreal lifespans, cities with names we still recognize. Flood hits, everything resets. Post-flood world, a brand new starting point. New dynasties, more human-length reigns. Same story, we didn't invent this. It came down again. It's like the tablets are telling us. We're living in version 2. There was a version 1. It got wiped. And that's the part that freaks people out. Because if Sumer is not the beginning, just a reboot, then what exactly did the flood erase? From the Sumerian point of view, something huge vanished. They keep hinting at it. Pre-flood sages, the Apkallu. Pre-flood kings with impossible longevity. Pre-flood cities now only names and lists. Pre-flood knowledge they insist was different. The flood isn't just destruction. It's a hard reset. A deliberate wipe. Enough survives that people don't go back to living in caves. But not enough that they can fully recreate whatever came before. So what you get? Survivors. Fragmented stories. Half-understood systems. A feeling that we were given this once, and then we were given it again. The tablets preserve their side. The soil preserves the disaster. But there's one more category of evidence that almost never makes it into the documentaries. Not clay, not mud, bone. because buried in some of the oldest graves of Mesopotamia are skeletons that don't look quite like us. And the way those remains have been handled might be the most revealing part of this whole story. We'll get into that in the next section. In 1929, while digging through the Royal Cemetery of UR, Leonard Woolley and his team uncovered something that didn't match anything they'd seen before. Not golden headdresses, not lyres or jewelry, not fancy grave goods. Bones. Specifically, skulls that didn't look like normal human skulls. These skulls were elongated, rising high into a tall, narrow shape, with proportions that didn't quite fit standard human anatomy. At first glance, that sounds like cranial binding, the known ancient practice of wrapping babies' heads to reshape the skull for aesthetic or cultural reasons. Woolley considered that too. Some of the skulls did show patterns consistent with binding, but others? He described them using a phrase that should have set off alarms in every lab on Earth. Internal structural elongation. In other words, not just the outside of the skull reshaped by pressure. The inside was different. Sutures, the joints between skull bones, weren't where they normally are. Bone thickness patterns didn't match deformation. Cranial capacity appeared larger than usual in some cases. Binding can change the shape. It cannot increase internal volume, move sutures, alter deep bone architecture. Yet some of these skulls seem to show exactly that. So what happened to them? They were cataloged, photographed, carefully packed, shipped off to museum storage, and then mostly forgotten. They're in archives. They exist, but they are almost never shown, discussed, or deeply analyzed in mainstream publications. This wasn't an isolated case. At Kish, in one of the deepest, oldest tombs, dated to around 3100 BC, archaeologists found a skeleton with a skull that was dramatically long. Dolichocephalic is a technical term, much longer than it is wide. One of the excavators, Ernest Mackay, sketched it in his notes. He wrote something along the lines of, uncertain if result of binding or natural formation. Later, a different hand added a margin note. Recommend further analysis. Anatomical features inconsistent with known binding practices. That further analysis never made it into the literature. The skull was boxed, labeled, and put away. Again, this pattern isn't unique to Mesopotamia. You see it globally. In Egypt, the royal family of Amarna, Akhenaten and Nefertiti and their daughters, are almost always shown in art with long, high skulls, narrow faces, strange, almost androgynous bodies. For decades, people said, oh, that's just an artistic style. But when probable remains of Akhenaten were examined, they showed skeletal anomalies that weren't so easy to explain away. Add to that statues and reliefs of his daughters with the same elongated heads, and suddenly stylistic choice feels a little thin. In Peru, the Paracas culture produced some of the most extreme elongated skulls ever found. At first, everyone assumed this is just binding, but physical anthropologists noticed a few problems. Some Paracas skulls have up to 25% larger cranial volume than typical humans. Some have one parietal bone where humans have two. The hole where the spinal cord enters foramen magnum is in a slightly different position. Binding doesn't do that. Binding can change shape, not internal structure. In 2014, preliminary DNA tests on Paracas remains showed mitochondrial DNA consistent with Native American ancestry, nuclear DNA fragments with strange anomalies that didn't map cleanly onto known modern human haplogroups. The results were controversial. Absolutely. They need replication. But they raise a question nobody really wants to touch. Are we looking at an unusual but still normal human variation? Something like an isolated clan with odd genetics? Or evidence of a population that doesn't fit neatly into our current evolutionary story? Now, bring the focus back to Mesopotamia. Remember the Ubaid culture? Those prehistoric farmers and builders who were there long before the Sumerians. From around 6500 to 3800 BC, they left behind their pottery, their ruins, and something else. Those infamous Ubaid figurines. Tiny clay statues depicting humanoid beings with long, narrow heads, large, slanted, almost reptilian eyes, slim necks, sometimes holding infants with the same features. You'll see them behind glass with labels like ritual object, fertility figure, which is archaeology speak for. We have no idea what this actually is. But what's striking is a consistency. These aren't abstract squiggles. They are portraits of a type, same head shape, same facial structure, across multiple sites separated by hundreds of kilometers, long before any known cranial binding traditions in that region. So, what exactly were they imitating? Then there's Tel Brak in northern Mesopotamia. In one temple, archaeologists found a room filled with thousands of tiny alabaster figurines with huge eyes. It's now called the Eye Temple. Same body size, same stylized tunic, same massively exaggerated eyes. Max Malawan, who excavated it, called them votive offerings. Okay, offerings to who? And why this specific hyperfocus feature? The eyes are so big that they're well beyond normal human proportion. Once again, we're staring at a pattern. Strange humanoid figures, repeating across cultures, linked to temples, rituals, and early stages of civilization. Back at Eridu, which the King List calls the first city, home of the first pre-flood king, deep under later Sumerian levels, archaeologists found something else weird. Bones again. Some remains are showed. Larger than average bones. Stronger muscle attachment points. Skeletal proportions suggesting individuals taller and more robust than the typical population. Nothing supernatural there by itself. Tall people exist. But these anomalous skeletons show a cluster in some of the deepest, oldest layers. The foundation levels of the earliest temples. The same levels associated with the cult of Enki, the god who supposedly designed humans and gave the first cities their knowledge. These remains were recorded in field notes, boxed and stored, but not given the spotlight. Very few thorough osteological studies. Almost no public discussion. It's not that they disappeared. They just stopped being mentioned. Why? Partly because archaeology runs on narratives. We like clear stories. Humans evolved here. They migrated there. They invented this, then that. Timeline nice and straight. Anomalous bones, odd cranial shapes, weird outlier skeletons. They're messy. They raise questions like, were there isolated populations with very different genetics? Did we really map all the branches of the human tree correctly? Could there have been hominid groups that survived longer or evolved differently than we thought? Every answer blows a hole in somebody's neat diagram. So, instead of digging deeper into the weird bits, the system tends to do this. Label it unusual, file it, move on to safer ground. Not necessarily because of conspiracy, mostly because of career pressure, funding, and paradigm inertia. But the result is the same. Evidence that doesn't fit quietly slides off the table. Now stack the anomalies together. Obeyed figurines with elongated reptilian heads. Elongated skulls in early royal burials. Skeletal remains with unusual robustness in the oldest layers. Global parallels from Egypt to Peru. Then overlay that with Sumerian texts saying, pre-flood kings weren't like us. They ruled for tens of thousands of years. Civilization was established by beings who came down from heaven. You don't have to jump straight to aliens. You don't have to believe every fringe theory. But it's hard not to at least ask, did the Sumerians preserve a memory, distorted, mythologized, but rooted in something of a physically different ruling class? Whether that was an ancient human variant, a now-lost branch of hominids, or something stranger we don't have a category for yet. The important part is, the texts say their earliest rulers weren't like normal humans. The bones quietly hint that some ancient individuals might not have been either. And instead of putting these two lines of evidence into the same conversation, most of the time, we keep them in different rooms and pretend they're unrelated. Whatever those beings were, the Sumerians say this: their time ended. The flood cut the cord. The old rulers vanished. The line of kings restarted with more human-scale lifespans. But the influence of those earlier beings? The Sumerians didn't think it was gone. They thought it lingered in bloodlines, in knowledge, in certain tablets nobody was supposed to read casually. And this brings us to another layer of the story. Not just what was buried in the ground, but what was buried in archives. Because when the cuneiform tablets started coming out of the sand and into European museums, some of the translations that emerged were considered too dangerous to share widely. In the next section, we're going to talk about the library of Ashurbanipal, the tablets that got headlines, and the ones that quietly disappeared into basements, all while hinting at a version of early human history we were never really prepared to face. In 1849, a British adventurer named Austin Henry Layard started digging into a mound along the Tigris River, not far from modern Mosul. Locals called it Kiyunjik. The ancient world had called it Nineveh, the capital of Assyria. What Layard found there changed history. Under the dust of fallen walls and collapsed palaces, his team uncovered room after room filled not with gold, but with clay. Shells of clay, jars of clay, floors covered in broken clay, tens of thousands of cuneiform tablets, stacked like a forgotten hard drive from the ancient world. This was the library of Ashurbanipal. Ashurbanipal wasn't just a warlord. He was a book hoarder. In the 7th century BC, he ordered his scribes to collect every important text in Mesopotamia. Myths, histories, medical texts, astronomical records, rituals, laws, even older tablets copied from earlier, now vanished archives. When these tablets arrived in London and were unpacked in the British Museum, nobody realized what they were holding. They knew it was ancient writing. They had no idea some of it would quietly blow up the foundations of Western religious and historical belief. Enter George Smith. Smith wasn't a professor. He was a banknote engraver turned self-taught cuneiform expert, working in the museum's backrooms for low pay and less recognition. In 1872, while piecing fragments of a large broken tablet together, he suddenly froze. The text he was decoding described a man warned of an oncoming flood, a massive boat sealed with pitch, animals taken aboard, waters that wiped out humanity, birds released to see if the land had reappeared. Sound familiar? Smith realized what he was reading. The flood story from the Epic of Gilgamesh, a version of Noah's Ark story written more than 1,000 years before Genesis. Witnesses said he literally jumped up, ran around the room, and started tearing off his clothes in excitement. Victorian newspapers went wild. Headlines basically screamed, "The Bible copied from Babylon." Of course, it's more complex than that. But one thing was clear. The story of the Great Flood was not unique to the Bible. The clay had told it first. That tablet got front-page treatment, but many others did not. As Smith and other scholars kept translating Ashurbanipal's collection, they ran into texts that were harder to package for public consumption. The Atrahasis epic, for example. We've talked about it already, but imagine reading it in the 19th century. The gods are overworked. They revolt. A solution is proposed. Create a worker species. A god is killed. His blood is mixed with clay. The mixture is divided into vessels. Incantations are recited. Humans are formed. It doesn't sound like, "let there be light." It sounds like a lab procedure. Victorian scholars were not ready to stand up and say, "Hey, this 3,500-year-old tablet just described something that sounds like genetic engineering." So they did what they could, emphasize the mythological language, softened the clinical tone in translation, framed it as metaphor, divine spark in clay, not process documented in steps. Technically, they weren't lying, but they also weren't telling the whole story the tablets told. Other texts were even touchier. Some tablets in the library describe the Anunnaki not as vague sky spirits, but as judges, city builders, lawgivers, physical beings who descended to Earth. One fragment, often cited in internal catalogs but rarely printed in popular collections, calls them those who from the shining heavens to the dark earth descended. Not symbolically, not allegorically, just literally. Those passages were translated, yes, but they mostly stayed in specialist journals, internal notes, or unpublished archives. Not because there was an evil conspiracy with guys stroking white cats in smoky rooms, but because every translator was working inside a worldview where the Bible had to stay unique. Human history had to start recently. Non-European cultures were assumed primitive, and anything that didn't fit was automatically labeled mythic exaggeration. The easiest way to keep the paradigm intact? Push the weird stuff to the side and just not talk about it much. Then came the astronomy tablets. The series known as Enuma Anu in Lil reads like an ancient NASA report. Planet positions, eclipse predictions, star catalogs, long-term celestial cycles. One text records a cycle of Venus returning to the same position relative to the Sun as 584 days. The actual modern calculated value? 583.92 days. That's an error of less than 0.02%. They had similar precision for Jupiter, Saturn, and complex lunar eclipses. When these were first properly studied, modern astronomers assumed, okay, these must be based on observations from Ashurbanipal's own time. But then they noticed phrases like, according to the old writings, which means these weren't new observations. They were copies, preserving data that, according to the texts themselves, originated in pre-flood times, under the rule of antediluvian kings and sages. So now you're stuck with two options. Either that's literary flair and all the before the flood stuff is poetic language, or ancient Mesopotamia had star records stretching back thousands of years earlier than we're comfortable admitting. Guess which option mainstream academia picked. And it wasn't just floods and stars. Some tablets describe the Apkallu, those pre-flood sages sent by Enki. 7 of them, each tied to a specific city, each credited with teaching a specific domain of knowledge: writing, city planning, agricultural techniques, sacred rituals. They weren't described as gods. They were described as hybrids, part human, part divine, walking the earth before the flood, teaching people the foundations of civilization. Later kings would brag, I come from the line of the Apkallu, as if claiming descent from them gave you extra legitimacy. Again, you can say mythology, storytelling, political propaganda. But the tablets don't treat them like vague legends. They treat them like historical figures, individuals with names, cities, tasks, people you could, in theory, put on a timeline. And that was deeply uncomfortable for a 19th century worldview that needed everything non-biblical to be either heathen myth or unimportant background noise. So the Apkallu got pushed into footnotes. You might think, okay, but that was the 1800s. Surely by now we've gone back, translated everything, and aired it all out. You'd hope, but there are a few problems. There are hundreds of thousands of tablets still untranslated. Translation is slow, unglamorous work. Funding tend to go to safe projects. And some tablets have simply disappeared. During the 2003 Iraq invasion, the National Museum in Baghdad was looted. Thousands of artifacts vanished. Some were broken. Some were smuggled out and sold. Some were recovered years later on the black market. Many were not. Among the missing, Mesopotamian tablets that had never been fully translated or published. Whatever they contained is now gone, or in some private collection, or sitting in a warehouse with no record of what they actually say. In 2015, ISIS militants destroyed parts of the Mosul Museum and smashed ancient sites like Nimrud. We watched videos of sledgehammers smashing statues and tablets. All of that data, that memory, that written record of a world before ours, turned to dust. Not because it was unimportant, but because it was dangerous to the group's ideology. They wanted to erase any past that didn't fit their narrative of how history should be. And that instinct, sadly, isn't unique to extremists with sledgehammers. It's just more obvious when it's violent. When data doesn't fit a story, it usually gets one of 3 fates: destroyed, ignored, or quietly buried in storage. So where does that leave us? We have a flood story older than the Bible, a creation story that sounds like bioengineering, a list of pre-flood kings whose reigns don't fit human biology, references to pre-flood sages who brought advanced knowledge, astronomy records that imply ridiculously long observation baselines, and thousands of tablets still sitting in museum basements unstudied. Are all of them going to reveal some shocking hidden history? No, most are probably receipts. Literally. Grain rations, tax lists, temple inventories. But hidden among the boring stuff we've already found. Enough of the weird slipped through to raise serious questions. Questions like, where did all this advanced knowledge really come from? Who were these before the flood, beings everyone keeps talking about? And why did so many early scholars seem determined to downplay or sidestep the most disturbing passages? The clay doesn't care about our comfort. It doesn't care about our timelines, our dogmas, our careers. It just sits there, millennia deep, saying, this is what someone thought was important enough to carve into stone, so time couldn't erase it. The real question is, are we willing to actually read what they wrote? Because if we do, then we have to confront something even harder than long-lived kings or descending gods. We have to confront the possibility that civilization didn't start with us. We walked into a story that was already in progress. And some of the earliest, strangest evidence of that is still hiding on those tiny stone cylinders and buried tablets, quietly telling a story about who brought knowledge down and why. In the next part, we're going to zoom in on those images. The cylinder seals the handbag gods, the global Orion pattern, and ask if the sky itself is trying to tell us the same story the clay has been whispering all along. The cylinder seals are tiny. Most of them are smaller than your thumb. You'd probably walk right past one in a museum, unless you knew what you were looking at, because when you roll those little carved cylinders across wet clay, they explode into entire scenes. And those scenes are where the weirdness starts. Over and over, the same story shows up. Tall beings towering over humans. Strange objects in their hands. Symbols of stars and suns. And a repeating pattern of gifts being handed down. These weren't random doodles. In the ancient world, seals were signatures, IDs, official stamps. You use your seal to sign contracts, lock containers, authorize commands. You don't put nonsense on something that represents you. You put what matters. And what mattered to these people, what they literally pressed into clay as their identity, was a story of beings from above giving structure and power to the world below. Let's start with the famous handbags. You've probably seen them online, those little box-shaped objects with a rounded handle at the top, held in the hands of gods, sages, and strange figures. Archaeologists officially call them buckets. Ritual containers, purification tools, end of discussion. Except it's very clearly not the end, because the shape is consistent, detailed, and global. In Sumerian and Akkadian seals, you see tall figures, often associated with the Anunnaki or with the Apkallu, holding these objects as they interact with humans or sacred trees. In some scenes, they're reaching out with one hand toward a stylized tree of life and holding the handbag in the other. In others, kings are being led by a god carrying that same object. It always shows up in context of transfer. Transfer of authority. Transfer of knowledge. Transfer of something tangible but undefinable. Now, jump thousands of miles and thousands of years away. You see the same object in Olmec carvings in Mesoamerica, Maya reliefs, Toltec sculptures, same shape, rectangular body, arched handle, held by godlike beings. Officially, we're told, that's just a coincidence. Different cultures came up with the same symbol independently. Sure, cultures can independently invent pyramids, circles, straight lines. But a specific little handheld bag-shaped object used in the same symbolic way by people who supposedly never met each other? At some point, coincidence stops being an explanation and starts being a dodge. Then there are the horned headdresses. In Mesopotamian art, gods and semi-divine beings are almost always shown wearing helmets with multiple horns. Humans? Never. The horns are a status marker. The more horns, the higher the rank. When you see a towering figure in a horn crown, that's a judge, a sky being, an Anunnaki-level authority. And what are they doing? Not floating around vaguely in the clouds. They're sitting on thrones in real rooms, meeting kings, handing over rods, rings, and those mysterious buckets. standing next to objects that look suspiciously like technology. In some seals, they're towering over human attendants with one foot on a kind of platform or step that doesn't seem architectural, more like a device. Again, you can say stylistic exaggeration. Ancient artists often drew rulers bigger than everyone else to show rank. But in these scenes, the proportions feel more specific. The humans aren't knee-high caricatures. They're scaled carefully. The gods are simply larger. Physically, different. It matches what the texts say. The Anunnaki weren't just ideas. They walked. They judged. They built. They stood in rooms with people and gave them orders. Then we have the radiant discs. On some seals, above the figures, you see circular shapes with rays coming out, often called solar symbols. Sometimes they probably are, but in certain seals, the detail goes beyond a simple sun icon. You see concentric circles, structured lines, edge markings, almost like a mechanical object, not just a drawn star. In one seal, a large disc-like object appears above a seated figure, while others stand in front of him in a posture of worship or submission. The disc isn't placed randomly. It dominates the scene. It's the focal point. To the modern eye, it looks uncomfortable. It looks like something in the sky, emitting energy, observed from below. Ancient artists didn't have a sci-fi vocabulary. They drew with what they knew: circles, lines, rays. So whether we're looking at a symbol or a literal memory, the message is the same. Whatever was up there mattered enough to be carved into an official seal. Now zoom out from the seals and look at the cities themselves. The sky isn't just background. It's baked into the foundations. Eridu, the city the Sumerians said first held kingship after it descended from heaven, wasn't randomly placed. Its temple aligns almost perfectly north-south. Its orientation seems tuned to the rising of Sirius, the brightest star in the sky, which later cultures, Egyptians Dogon, Maya, would also obsess over. Uruk, in Nana's city, is aligned to the movements of Venus. Her myths, descending into the underworld and re-emerging, mirror Venus's behavior in the sky, disappearing and returning as morning and evening star. Her temple complexes line up with key points in that cycle. These aren't casual coincidences. They represent long-term observation, precise measurement, architectural alignment with celestial events. The same thing happens in Egypt and in Mesoamerica and in other megalithic sites worldwide. Which brings us to one of the most controversial patterns of all, Orion's belt. We've talked about Giza and Orion in the previous series. Now look at the wider pattern. In Egypt, the three pyramids of Giza mirror the three belt stars of Orion. Their sizes correspond to the star's brightness. The offset of the smallest pyramid matches the offset of Mintaka. In Mexico, the Pyramid of the Sun, the Pyramid of the Moon, and the Temple of Quetzalcoatl at Teotihuacan also line up in a pattern that mirrors Orion's belt in Mesopotamia. Some temple layouts and city plans form geometric relationships that echo the same stellar arrangement. Ancient texts refer to Orion as a place associated with gods, heroes, and the realm between heaven and earth. Different names, same stars, same pattern, same this matters energy. You can dismiss each case individually. The Egyptians were just into symmetry. Teotihuacan is just urban planning with some astronomical flavor. Sumer just loved star symbolism. But the triple repetition across continents, all choosing the same three stars as the backbone of their most sacred complexes, that starts to sound less like coincidence and more like a signature, a calling card, an address. The Sumerians weren't shy about how they viewed this. For them, those divine building blocks of civilization weren't philosophical abstractions. They were treated almost like devices. In the myth of Inanna and Enki, Enki gets drunk. Inanna persuades him to hand over the me. He physically loads him onto her boat. She takes them to Uruk, and suddenly Uruk becomes the cultural powerhouse of the region. They're listed out like a software package. Kingship, music, writing, law, craftsmanship, ritual, truth, descent to the underworld, return from the underworld, things that we think of as cultural, psychological, philosophical. They thought of as modular, transferable, almost like plugins you could grant or withhold. That's a weird way to talk about ideas, unless you didn't see them as just ideas. Unless you saw them as something brought by someone, carried from one place to another, bestowed selectively, which is exactly what their stories keep repeating. Enki gives them me, Inanna steals them, kings inherit them. Civilization moves wherever they go. And here's where all these threads start to converge. The cylinder seals show beings taller than humans handing over objects. The text describe principles of civilization as physical things that can be transported. The cities themselves are aligned to specific stars, planets, and constellations. The same star patterns show up in Egypt and Mesoamerica. Global myths all tell the same story. Something or someone came down and taught us. You don't have to leap straight to ancient aliens to see that something is off. Even if you frame it purely as symbolic, mythic memory, psychological projection, there's still a pattern. Humanity, in story after story, did not see itself as the inventor of civilization. It saw itself as the recipient. The student, not the professor. The intern, not the CEO. In the Sumerian version, we weren't just guided. We were designed, crafted out of clay and blood, to carry the workload the gods no longer wanted, then handed tools, rules, and rhythms that matched something much bigger than us. The stars, the cycles, the geometry of time itself. Everywhere you look, in seals and temples, in the layout of cities, the same message keeps repeating in picture and stone. We did not start this. We inherited it. The only question is, inherited from who? And if those who gave it to us once walked among humans, why did they leave? In the next part, we'll go one step further into the unsettling territory of the genome, the bottlenecks, the accelerated evolution zones, and how all of that sounds uncomfortably similar to what those clay tablets have been hinting at for 5,000 years. If everything we've seen so far hints that civilization was given rather than invented, then the next question gets personal. What were we before that? What were humans before kingship descended? Before the me? Before the flood reset the world? To answer that, we have to leave clay behind for a moment and look at something even older. Our DNA. Right now, every person on Earth, every culture, every nationality, every race, is part of a single family. Genetically, we're shockingly close. And that's not just sentiment. That's hard data. When scientists mapped the human genome and compared populations around the world, they found a pattern you'd expect to see after a disaster. Around 70,000 years ago, humanity hit what's called a bottleneck. Our ancestors' numbers crashed hard. Some estimates say the global human population dropped to as low as a few thousand breeding individuals. Not a tribe, not a city, a small town's worth of people for the entire planet. Something almost wiped us out. The leading suspect? A volcanic event called the Toba supereruption, plus climate chaos that followed. Whatever the exact trigger, the result is clear, written right into our genes. We almost didn't make it. But here's where it gets really interesting. After that bottleneck, something weird happens in the evolutionary record. Between about 200,000 and 50,000 years ago, especially in the last slice of that range, human cognition suddenly jumps. We go from simple stone tools, limited symbolic behavior, basic social structures, to abstract art, complex language, ritual burial, long-distance trade, deliberate multi-step technology. In evolutionary terms, that kind of shift usually takes millions of years. We did it in a blink. When geneticists dug into this, they found regions in our DNA called human accelerated regions, or HARs. These are stretches of DNA that stayed pretty stable for hundreds of millions of years of vertebrate evolution. Then, in humans, suddenly mutated and changed thousands of times faster than normal. One of the most famous, HAR1, is linked to brain development. It barely changed between chicken, mouse, and chimp. Then in humans, it rewrote itself. If evolution is usually a slow dimmer switch, HARs look like someone flicked on a light. Now, to be super clear, this doesn't prove anything supernatural. Science, by design, looks for natural causes. Most researchers will tell you, maybe small genetic tweaks had big knock-on effects. Maybe social complexity created selection pressure for smarter brains. Maybe we're still underestimating how chaotic and fast evolution can be. And all of that might be true. But step back for a second and look at the story structure. In our DNA, we see a near extinction, a reboot from a tiny surviving group, a sudden jump in cognition. In the Sumerian tablets, we see the gods tired of labor, a decision to create workers, clay mixed with divine essence. A new kind of being appears, built for labor but endowed with something extra. Thousands of years before we had genetics, the oldest written creation myth on Earth describes humanity as a deliberately engineered upgrade, not grown, not gradually awakened, crafted. If you handed a Bronze Age scribe the concept of gene editing, how would they explain it? They have no vocabulary for DNA, no diagrams of chromosomes, no microscopes. What do they have? Clay, blood, vessels, ritual language. So the Atrahasis epic gives us, let one god be slaughtered, with his flesh and blood, let nin to mix clay, let God and man be mixed together in clay. 7 male and 7 female forms are shaped, incantation spoken, and from the mixture, humanity, engineered for work, capable of understanding orders, carrying something of the gods inside. Clay plus blood is the closest metaphor you can get to. Take base matter, add living code, combine. To us, it sounds mythic. To them, it probably sounded technical. Now bring the timeline back towards Sumer, because after that bottleneck and that cognitive jump, something else shows up in the archaeological record. Anomalies. Genetic studies on some of the oldest skeletons from Mesopotamia show strange patterns, markers that don't neatly match known population flows. They're not Neanderthal signatures. We already know those. They're not Denisovan either. Those are mapped. These are outliers, little blips in the code that say something else was here once, a lineage that doesn't fit. Some of those lineages disappear from later samples, like a branch that got cut. At the same time, physically we see odd cranial shapes, skeletal robustness, skulls from early layers with features that don't quite match standard Homo sapiens. Nothing definitive, nothing that rewrites the textbooks overnight, but just enough to whisper. Maybe the cast of characters in early civilization wasn't as simple as we think. The Sumerians said their earliest kings weren't normal humans. They ruled for tens of thousands of years. They were closer to the gods than to men. The flood, in their story, didn't just wipe out cities. It wiped out a type of being, a whole version of kingship. And after that, you get kings with long lives, but not impossible ones. It's like someone slashed the timeline. Pre-flood, long-lived, semi-divine rulers. Post-flood, upgraded humans, but fully mortal. Almost like version 1 was retired. Version 2 took over. This is where archaeology gets uncomfortable. Because the deeper you go in those Mesopotamian layers, the more you hit things that don't fit perfectly. Flood, silt-dividing eras. Advanced planning in cities that shouldn't be that advanced yet. Submerged river valleys in the Persian Gulf that look like perfect cradles for lost settlements. Strange skulls and bones archived away with minimal follow-up. And on top of all that, a civilization that keeps insisting, we did not start this. We were restored. We remembered. Sumer doesn't act like a people inventing civilization. They act like a people rebooting it, picking up broken pieces, trying to imitate something older, from star charts they say came from before the flood, to language they treat as sacred and already ancient, to rituals explicitly described as reenactments of the first time. They're not boasting about being first. They're obsessed with being faithful to something earlier. So imagine this for a second, not as proven fact, but as a thought experiment. An earlier human or human-adjacent civilization rises during a warm period before the ice fully retreats. They reach a level of knowledge that includes long-term astronomy, advanced architecture, maybe even some form of bioengineering we'd barely recognize. They're hit by catastrophic climate events, impacts, floods, volcanic eruptions. Most of them die. A scattered handful survive in refuges, river valleys, highlands, sheltered coasts. They keep fragments, stories, star cycles, rituals, genetic tweaks, a language. Thousands of years later, their descendants rebuild in Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus, the Andes. To the new humans around them, these survivors would look like gods, longer lived, smarter, carrying knowledge no one else had. They teach, they rule, they engineer, and when they're gone, all that's left is clay, stone, and memory. We call that mythology. They called it history. That's the forbidden edge of this whole topic. Not aliens with ray guns, not cartoon conspiracies. Something much weirder and closer to home. That we might not be the first version of us. That there may have been earlier cycles, earlier rises, earlier falls, and what we call the beginning of history is just the first time writing survived the reset. Sumer isn't the start. It's the first save file that didn't get overwritten. Everything before, still on the drive, but marked as deleted, and yet the clay is still here. Those tablets do not care about our timelines or our comfort. They say what they say. Kingship descended. We were made. The world was flooded. Knowledge returned. We rebuilt, not as the first light in the darkness, but as people walking in the glow of something older. In the next part, we'll pull all of this together. The tablets, the bones, the myths, the stars, and the uncomfortable possibility that human history is a loop, not a line, and that the Sumerians weren't just telling stories. They were leaving a message for whoever came next. Let's pull the threads together, because at this point, this isn't just a collection of weird facts and ancient stories. It's starting to feel like a pattern that points to a story we were never taught. If you zoom out, here's what we have. A language Sumerian that shows up fully formed, complex, and isolated. A writing system, cuneiform, that appears already capable of laws, math, and myth. A king list that calmly logs rulers who reigned for impossible spans before a flood. Flood layers in the soil exactly where the texts say disaster struck. Pre-Sumerian cities buried under Sumerian ones, with signs of advanced planning. Elongated skulls and anomalous remains in some of the deepest layers. Astronomical tablets that map the skies with precision that should take centuries to develop. Global myths telling the same story. Beings from above, knowledge given, flood, restart. None of these things by themselves force a conclusion, but together they whisper the same dangerous idea. Civilization may not be a one-time event. It may be a cycle. Modern history like straight lines. We're taught first came hunter-gatherers, then farming, then cities, then writing, then science, then us. It's a neat arc, constant progress, from caves to computers. We like that story because it flatters us. We're the newest version, the most advanced, the final stage. But the Sumerian tablets don't speak that language. They talk like people living in the ruins of someone else's brilliance. They talk like inheritors, not inventors. When they carve, after the flood, kingship descended from heaven. They're not bragging. They're confessing. They're saying, we didn't start this. We're just the first ones you can still read. So why is this idea so radioactive? Why does mainstream academia push back so hard whenever anyone suggests a deeper past, a broken cycle, or a lost phase of civilization? There are a few reasons, and none of them are purely evil or conspiratorial. First, their scope. If you accept that a lot of our myths might encode real events from 10,000 or 20,000 years ago, then archaeology suddenly has to deal with submerged coastlines, regions now buried under deltas and deserts, ruins eroded to nothing, civilizations whose building materials decayed long ago. Most of the places where a coastal culture would have thrived at the end of the last ice age, they're underwater. We haven't looked there properly. That's not a conspiracy. That's just budget and logistics. Second, there's paradigm. Science advances by building models. Those models become careers. Careers become institutions. If you spent 40 years of your life specializing in the earliest cities of Sumer, and then along comes evidence that your earliest cities are actually rebuilds, it doesn't mean you're dishonest. It means your entire framework needs an update you never trained for. That's hard for any human. Third, there's fear. Because this story, if it's even partly true, isn't comforting. It doesn't just say, we're older than we thought. It says, we've crashed before. Think about what it does to our sense of security. Right now, we like to imagine, if we push technology far enough, if we manage climate change, if we avoid nuclear war, we'll just keep going forever. But the Sumerian version of history sounds more like this. Civilizations rise. They reach a peak. Something breaks, cosmic, climatic, or self-inflicted. They fall hard. Survivors rebuild with fragments. The next cycle calls itself first. It's not a straight line. It's a spiral. And spirals can go down as easily as up. The flood myths all share the same emotional core. We thought this world would last forever. It didn't. Whether you frame it as God's angry at human noise, cosmic justice, natural catastrophe, or pure bad luck, the experience of survivors is the same. A horizon where land used to be, an empty shoreline where home once stood, a silence where cities used to roar. If those survivors passed down anything, it wouldn't be detailed technical manuals. Those get lost first. It wouldn't be blueprints. Those decay. It would be stories, rituals, star patterns, sacred words and phrases. And if you fast forward a few thousand years, those survivors' descendants would have strange traditions they can't explain, sacred numbers they repeat without knowing why, architectures they build because that's how the ancestors did it. Sound familiar? Sumerian temples aligned with stars, Egyptian rituals reenacting the first time, Mesoamerican calendars tracking cycles that stretch far before their own recorded history. It's like being born into a house full of tools you didn't design. You know some of what they do, but not why they were really made. Here's another uncomfortable angle. If we really are living in just one iteration of a longer pattern, then the Sumerians weren't just telling us where we came from. They might also have been warning us. The flood in their texts wasn't random. It was consequence. Sometimes for human behavior, sometimes for the chaos of the cosmos, but always painted as something that could happen again. Their entire culture is obsessed with maintaining order. Ma'at in Egypt, me in Sumer, Dharma in India. Different words. Same idea. If we fall out of balance, chaos returns. And what does chaos look like? In their oldest stories, sky falling, waters rising, fire from above, darkness, reset. Those are mythic images, but they rhyme disturbingly well with asteroid impacts, mega floods, volcanic winters, climate collapse. You don't need to stretch too far. So where does that leave us? Here we are, with tech their myths could never imagine, with global networks they never had, with satellites instead of star priests. And yet, we face eerily similar threats. Climate instability, rising seas, fragmenting societies, fragile resource systems. The Sumerians described gods. We describe systems. They talked about angering heaven. We talk about pushing planetary boundaries. Different language, same fear. If we mismanage this, the reset comes. But there's another side to this. One that's easy to miss if we get lost in the doom. Because as dark as their stories are, they're also full of hope. The world ends. But it doesn't end. A few people survive. Knowledge survives. Some of it buried in clay. Some of it carved into stone. Some of it encoded in ritual. Some of it maybe carried in DNA itself. Civilization collapses, but it comes back. Not identical. Not perfect. But it returns. Again and again. If they're right about anything, it might be this. We're harder to erase than we think. Think of the Sumerian tablets as a message in a bottle. A message written by people who knew they were living in the after of something bigger. They couldn't preserve everything. They couldn't stop the erosion of memory. But they could do this. Bake their words into stone. align their ziggurats to stars, wrap their rituals in phrases about the first time, tell their children, we weren't the first. The gods walked here. The world drowned once. Don't forget, we found that bottle. We're reading it, and we have to decide what to do with it. Do we say, cool story, bro mythology, and move on? Or do we allow the possibility, even a 1% chance, that they were telling a damaged, half-remembered version of something that really happened? Not because belief is fun, but because humility might be our best survival strategy. Here's the terrifying, thrilling possibility. We are not children of a random fluke wandering out of caves for the first time. We are the descendants of survivors. Survivors of floods. Survivors of extinctions. Survivors of resets we don't fully remember. And the memory of those resets might still be scattered across clay, stone, myth, genetics, waiting for a species advanced enough and honest enough to see the pattern, to admit we've been here before, and maybe to add, we don't want to do this again. In the final part, we're going to step all the way back. We'll look at what this story really asks of us, not just as curious minds digging into ancient texts, but as a civilization that may be standing at the same kind of crossroads the Sumerians dimly remembered. The question isn't just, what happened before us? It's, what do we do now that we know? So, what do we do with all of this? Because at this point, you're not just hearing about some weird old tablets in a museum. You're staring at a mirror that's quietly asking, are you really the first ones to get this far? The Sumerian scribes never met us, but they knew what it felt like to live in the shadows of a forgotten world. They knew what it meant to inherit cities built on older ruins, rituals nobody fully understood, stories about gods that sounded suspiciously like memory. And they did the one thing they could. They wrote, on clay, in code, in a language already old, hoping maybe that someone someday would read between the lines. Let's strip away all the labels. Forget mythology. Forget ancient aliens. Forget forbidden archaeology. At its core, this entire story asks three simple questions. Is it possible that advanced humans existed before the civilizations we currently call the first? Could a global or regional catastrophe have wiped most of them out, leaving only fragments of their knowledge? Are our oldest stories and monuments the emergency backup drive of that lost world? You don't have to answer yes to all three. You don't even have to answer yes to one. But you do have to admit this. The evidence sitting in museums, basements, and buried cities is strange enough that we know everything already is no longer a serious position. We don't. We're guessing. Sometimes with good data. Sometimes with broken pieces. Sometimes with blind spots big enough to drive an arc through. So here's one way to look at it. Imagine human history as a computer. The version we're taught in school? That's version 2.1. Stable, clean, mostly bug-free. But the tablets, the flood layers, the odd skeletons, the global myths? Those are like fragments of version 1.0 that somehow survived the crash. A line of code here, a corrupted file name there, an old directory called kings before the flood _final_ use this, that no one can open anymore. We booted back up. We installed a new operating system. We told ourselves it was the first one, but the old files are still in the background, and every now and then one opens by mistake. A myth that feels too specific. A temple aligned too perfectly. A tablet that talks about star cycles a primitive culture shouldn't know. Most of the time, we patch it with symbolic, religious, coincidence. Then we close the window and keep going. But what if our job isn't to close those windows? What if our job is to read them? Because here's the real twist. You don't need anyone in a lab coat or robe to give you permission to wonder. You're allowed to look at the Sumerian King List and say, I don't buy the 28,800-year reigns, but I do think they were trying to tell us there was a long before it. You're allowed to hear, kingship descended from heaven, and think, maybe that doesn't mean spaceships. Maybe it means knowledge arrives suddenly from a source nobody remembered clearly. You're allowed to look at global flood myths and say, This might be how traumatized survivors explain a very real, very physical disaster. You don't have to go all the way to aliens. You also don't have to stay stuck at, they were just making things up. There's a middle ground, a human ground, where myth is memory with the names worn off. Now zoom all the way back to us. Right now, our age, our version, we're standing in a world where ice sheets are melting, sea levels are creeping up, weather patterns are glitching out, technology is exploding faster than our ethics can keep up. We can scan galaxies, but we can't keep our own oceans clean. We can decode genomes, but we barely understand our own minds. We're geniuses with tools and idiots with consequences. If there was a version of civilization before us that crashed, would it really look that different from us? Probably not. They might have been brilliant at engineering, obsessed with monuments, power, and expansion, shockingly casual about long-term impact. Maybe they also thought, we've got this. Look at our cities. Look at our tech. Look at our gods. Nothing can touch us. And then something did. A comet, a climate shift, a chain reaction they didn't see coming. Suddenly it's ark time, mountain time, cave time, story time. But here's the hopeful part. They failed and we exist, which means their failure wasn't total. Somebody made it through. Somebody regrouped, relearned, rebuilt, and decided we're going to preserve something this time. Maybe that something is what we see in Sumer. A restart using preserved fragments of a lost world's knowledge. Not complete, not perfect, but enough. Enough to reseed writing geometry, astronomy, law. Enough to kickstart version 2.1. That's us. That's our timeline. And now we're the ones standing at the edge of the next unknown. So what does any of this actually ask from you? Not that you worship the Anunnaki. Not that you believe every tablet literally. Not that you accept any wild theory without question. What it really asks is simpler. Be humble. Don't assume we're the first or the best just because we're the latest. Be curious. When old stories repeat across continents, maybe don't shrug and say coincidence as your first move. Be honest. If evidence doesn't fit the model, maybe the model needs tweaking, not the evidence. Be responsible. If the pattern really is rise, peak, collapse, survive, rebuild, then we are currently in the peak part of that curve. What we do next decides how steep the drop is, or whether we can bend that line into something new. Because maybe the whole point of remembering previous cycles is this, so we don't have to repeat them. Now, will we ever find the smoking gun, the pre-flood library, the intact city under 100 meters of water, the one tablet that spells it all out in plain modern language? Maybe, maybe not. But here's the secret nobody tells you. We don't need the smoking gun to start acting like grown-ups. Whether the Sumerians were literally recording beings from heaven or poetically describing a lost phase of human civilization, the warning lands the same. You are not invincible. The sky can fall. The waters can rise. And everything you call permanent can disappear in a single bad century. They knew that. We pretend we don't. So here's how I'd sum it up. The Sumerian tablets don't just tell us about the past. They test us in the present. They ask, are you the kind of civilization that laughs off old warnings? Or the kind that listens, learns, and chooses differently? They offer us two identities. Arrogant firstborns who think everything started with us. Or humble inheritors who realize we're walking on the bones, stories, and ruins of world that came before. Only one of those identities has a shot at breaking the pattern. Only one has a chance to be the version that doesn't crash. Somewhere in a museum basement or under a meter of desert dust, there are still tablets no one has read. Still layers no one has dug. Still questions no one has asked honestly. We don't know what they say yet. We don't know how deep this story really goes. But we do know this. Clay remembers longer than flesh. Stone remembers longer than paper. Stars remember longer than both. And right now, we're in the incredibly rare position of being able to read all three at once. Clay, stone, sky. That's not an accident. That's a responsibility. If you made it all the way here, you're exactly the kind of person these stories were probably meant for. The ones who question. The ones who connect dots. The ones who don't shut down just because the answers get uncomfortable. So if this series woke something up in you, a curiosity, a doubt, a sense that we're part of something older and bigger, share it. Comment what you think, what you doubt, what you want to dig into next. And if you want more deep dives into the story's history, try to file under myth and forget. You already know what to do. Like the video, subscribe, hit the bell, because as long as we're here, as long as the tablets haven't turned to dust, as long as the stars are still above us, we have time to ask the oldest, most dangerous, most important question. What if we're not the first?